Greetings, welcome to the Evidence Reasons Academy. I'm making this video in response to some of Dr. Duff's comments in the side chat regarding while I was giving a talk on stupid selection, the problem of how stupid selection cannot, which is actually what happens if we have selection that is blind and has no foresight. A better metaphor for what happens then is stupid selection versus the way evolutionary biologists advertise natural selection as if it can act as an intelligent agent to create the appearance of design. That is very well articulated, but though the conclusion is wrong, it's articulated in Richard Dawkins' Blind Watchmaker. And it is, the question is, how has something as simple as a microbe supposedly evolved into something as complex as a human being? And you'll get a variety of explanations from evolutionary biologists. And one of the explanations, perhaps not the only one, but one of them, is so-called natural selection. Natural selection, as articulated by Darwin and other evolutionary biologists, I think is a misleading term, because to make that claim, one has to show that the evolution of complexity is natural. There is not any question that you could say that there is relative reproductive abundances. The odds will favor certain traits and features of creatures as far as reproduction in select environments. That's not a question. What is in question is whether this leads to whether reproductive favored odds in reproduction lead to the evolution of complexity. And I took great lengths to show there's a lot of observational evidence that things advertised as natural selection, often a consequence of that is gene loss. One cannot build complexity by losing genes. I cited a paper that said, two papers actually, one that said genome decays despite sustained fitness gains. Linsky was a co-author of that experiment. That's a big embarrassment. It's a big embarrassing admission that the genome decays despite natural selection, despite sustained fitness gains and adaptation. That is not good. And then another paper by Eugene Koonin, genome reduction, that is loss of genes. Genome reduction as the dominant mode of evolution. Genome reduction as the dominant mode of evolution. I cited Spiegelman's experiment. And then I went on to cite that fitness, as far as evolutionary biology is concerned, not only does it miss the mark in terms of relating it to the evolution of complexity, it is not defined. It is not very well defined. And I will show you, here is a paper right here on that topic. This is by Andreas Wagner, and I've cited him in many of my videos. He said, beyond the commonplace that fitness means the ability to survive and reproduce, fitness is difficult to define properly and nearly impossible to measure rigorously. And then he has another citation here. Let me see what it is. Robustness and evolvability and neutrality. Fitness is difficult to define properly and nearly impossible to measure rigorously. As I was discussing these serious academic topics, Dr. Duff then brought in the topic, tried to refute the issue of fitness by talking about pornography. I took real offense to that, sir. You could try to focus on the problem of definition of fitness and how that will matriculate into the ability of evolutionary biologists to prosecute their case that microbes will naturally evolve to something as complex as a human being. So I take exception to that, sir. I've seen quite a bit of these trollish comments that are either just derail or seek to just discredit me. They're not very well thought out. They seem just very reactive. I'm open to criticism, but not these things where you totally disregard when I'm just quoting straight from peer-reviewed literature. You're not going to appreciate the significance of it as far as its value to, its impact. Its significance to the credibility of evolutionary theory. So let me continue to read this. And by the way, you made several other mistakes that were kind of equal to that. Let me just point one of them out. You're talking about exons in the evolution of potassium ion channels. You refer to it in the issue of trying to say leptins and the movement of parts. Sir, the potassium ion channel is in all kingdoms of life, including prokaryotes. You can't invoke exons as an explanation. So, sorry, sir. There's been a lot of your comments that are about at that level. I would have expected someone of your caliber who is a supervisor of PhDs to realize that you don't have exons in prokaryotes. You can't use that as an explanation. Also, you have said that potassium ion channels, I'm assuming this or that, that it didn't evolve from something else. Well, sir, this is what I call Brandolini's law. You certainly could state then what it evolved from. So valid scientific theory has the form of okay, if you're going to define a process, you say, okay, here's the initial state, here's the final state, here is a credible process that will take it from the initial to final state. You did not describe what the initial state was, the final state being the potassium ion channel, the simple one, not the complex ones that they're numerous that are voltage gated and have all sorts of receptors. You could take a simple one. Define then what it evolved from and then the process. If you cannot describe that, you have a theory of well, it's possible, I don't know, but if you're going to advertise evolutionary theory as a fact for the evolution of the potassium ion channel, then you have no answers, sir. And that is exactly the problem. If you can, a potassium ion channel is just one system. So, I didn't appreciate that. I think it's a trollish comment, but I'm going to let it go because that does tell me that if you really had something good, you probably would be you'd be trying to reference papers. You'd be trying to reference actually relevant experiments, not things like your leptins or whatever they are. You'd start to describe the original state rather than these vague assertions to things that are undefinable, unreconstructible. You compare that to celestial mechanics. We can estimate the position of many of the planets in the solar system even thousands of years back, and we can make credible inferences. You cannot do that with evolutionary theory. So let me go back to fitness here. I'm just going to read this from Andreas Wagner's paper. This one, robustness, evolvability, and neutrality is one of them. And okay, so beyond the commonplace that fitness means the ability to survive and reproduce, fitness is difficult to define properly and nearly impossible to measure rigorously. To give an example, laboratory evolution experiments in microbes often use cell division rates of bacterial strains as indicators of fitness. While growth rate is certainly an important aspect of fitness, a myriad of other equally important aspects exist, including survival under starvation conditions, heat resistance, sporulation efficiency, germination rates, and so on. In addition, growth rates themselves could be measured in countless different laboratory experiments. Which of these would be most representative of the environments a microbe encountered in its recent evolutionary past? The answer is usually unknown and perhaps often unknowable. Such problems are exacerbated in higher organisms where sexual reproduction, age-specific mortality and fertility, an increased ability to change the environment, and smaller population size pose daunting principal and technical problems. Taken together, these difficulties mean that an unassailable measurement of any organism's fitness does in practice not exist. These difficulties mean that an unassailable measurement of any organism's fitness does in practice not exist. I also pointed out, this is echoed by Lewontin himself, who's very, very senior. Fitness is hard. It's not entirely clear what fitness is in the four complications in the evolutionary process, Santa Fe Bulletin 2003, winter. And so I'll put this on the table, and Dr. Duff starts talking about pornography, trying to make it relevant to the question of fitness. Sir, that was inappropriate. It's useless to trying to solve the evolutionary problem. Lewontin pointed out the problem of density-dependent selection. Density-dependent selection. He began to say, oh, look, if I just change the density of the alleles in a population, it seems to change the fitness. And he was like, well, then what does it really mean? What does it really mean? What are we measuring? Because you would think that an allele ought to have some inherent, quality to it, and it would assert itself. But no, it's dependent on the density of the alleles. And that was very disturbing. So by way of comparison, we would like some of our primitive metrics or observables, like say, okay, length and time, those are observables, to have a stable definition, or at least a way of measuring it. And then you can make good scientific theories with this. So let me show an example of this in physics and engineering. And physics and engineering are rich with examples of good science, which is more than I could say for evolutionary biology. So look at how they this is from the NIST, National Institutes of Standards. They describe how we can define units of length. And so even if we don't absolutely define what length is, we have a definition of how we can measure it. So you have units of length for meters, units of mass in kilograms. So the meter symbol is the SI unit of length. It is defined by taking the fixed numerical value of the speed of light in vacuum C to be 299,792,458 when expressed in the units of meters per second squared. The second is defined in terms of delta VCS. Okay, so second. The symbol S is the SI unit of time. It is defined by taking the fixed numerical value of the cesium delta C cesium, the unperturbed ground state hyperfine transition frequency of the cesium-133 atom, to be 9,192,631,770 when expressed in the unit hertz, which is equal to seconds to the minus 1. This is an example of how you define observables and the standard which the observables are measured. We see none of that level of precision in the definition of fitness in evolutionary biology. Okay, so if you're going to say, well, look, we can't possibly, that's asking too much. Fine. Then don't advertise evolutionary theory as science on the level of physics. In fact, Jerry Coyne said evolutionary biology lurks somewhere near the bottom, far closer to the pseudoscience of phrenology than to physics. And I could see why. So go ahead and make excuses for why it's not as good. That's fine. But don't advertise it as a good theory and then make excuses why, excuse it into the upper echelons of what is, give it a free pass to rise up to the upper echelons of actually credible theories like, say, electromagnetism. even though electromagnetic theory, the classical version, has only a classical domain, it kind of falls apart at the quantum level. Within its domain, it is king. And I mean, if you really want to make really good theories, then go to quantum electrodynamics. But even the classical approximation within its domain, within the classical domain, it's way better, way more attested to than evolutionary theory. So I heard one scientist, Dr. Chris Thompson, on video say, I asked him, do you think this is evolutionary theory as good as electromagnetism? He said, absolutely. And I just laughed in my head, tried not to be disrespectful. I said, you can dispense with evolutionary theory and the world will go on. You can't dispense with electromagnetic theory. Electromagnetic theory is the basis of electrical engineering. You can imagine your life without electricity. Enough said. I can't imagine my life without evolutionary biology, and I think the world will be a better place without it. It's science that is terrible. So let me look and see at Lewontin's essay here. Lewontin's essay, if I can find it. And I mean, Dr. Duff, why don't you read this? Stop talking about pornography. We're talking about fitness. It's unbecoming. It's useless. It's irrelevant. It's not addressing the point. So let me see if I could find it, because I was about not to make an issue of it, but now that I'm starting to talk about it, I think it is good that I have it. So okay, here it is. Okay, Lewontin. All right, this has somewhat disappeared from the internet. I don't know if it'll be available. My computer's a little slow here. So the SFI Bulletin, Santa Fe Institute Bulletin, winter 2003. And we could see it has all sorts of essays. This builds on Lewontin's other work. It's not like you can't find it. Some of the essentials elsewhere. Okay, so the essay, let me make it bigger. Four Complications in Understanding the Evolutionary Process, Richard C. Lewontin. All right, so why don't you discuss your solution to the problem Lewontin poses, rather than talking about pornography and fitness, okay? So here, in modern evolutionary theory, fitness is no longer... Oh, let me go back here. The difficulties of the concept of fitness are, unfortunately, much deeper than the problem of frequency and density dependence. The problem is that it is not entirely clear what fitness is. Darwin took the metaphorical sense of fitness literally. The natural properties of different types resulted in their differential fit into the environment in which they lived. The better the fit to the environment, the more likely they were to survive, and the greater their rate of reproduction. The differential rate of reproduction would then result in a change of abundance of the different types. In modern evolutionary theory, however, fitness is no longer a characterization of the relation of the organism to the environment that leads to reproductive consequences, but is meant to be a quantitative expression of the differential reproductive schedules themselves. Darwin's sense of fit has been completely bypassed. The natural properties of organisms lead to differential reproductive schedules, and these must somehow be mappable onto a quantitative function, fitness that can enter into formal prediction structures. There is also an implication that fitness is a scalar quantity, since much of the informal argument of evolutionary theory characterizes one type as more fit than another. To make such a scalar work in prediction, a standard variability model of reproduction has been created in which organisms have discrete generations so that all can be regarded as born simultaneously, and the differences in fitness are the different probabilities of survivorship to sexual maturity. Any relaxation from the standard viability model produces serious problems in the definition of fitness. If there are differences in fertility and the organisms are sexually reproducing, then fertility in the general case is a function of the mating pair. Averaging over different mating combinations will provide a mean fertility of each genotype, but such means are necessarily frequency dependent. So the quantitative values will change during the evolutionary process, and even the ordering of the type of fitness may shift. The fitness of a genotype can then not be assigned from a statement of its frequency in the population and the rules of mating preference. If we further relax the standard viability model to include all these species with overlapping generations and reproduction that occur over an extended period of the individual's lifetime, then the totality of the reproductive information consists in the age schedule of relative mortality and fertility of different types, embodied in the probability of living from birth to age X, 1X, in the number of offspring BX produced by an individual of age X in the interval of X to X plus DX. If the species is sexually reproducing, the vector of age-specific fertilities BX must be substituted by a matrix of the fertilities of couples BXY of females aged X and males aged Y for each genotypic composition of the pair. These are then averaged to produce a matrix of frequency-dependent means for each genotype. These values change not only as frequency changes, but as the population changes in its age distribution. The attempt by Fisher to circumvent these complications by defining fitness of the genotype as the root M of the Euler equation did not solve the problem, because it confuses the rate of reproduction of a type with the rate of reproduction by a type, which are not at all the same thing in a sexually reproducing species, and also assumes that the population is at the stable age distribution, which is not true for the population changing its type frequency. But the problem is even worse. It is the case that all the information about the relative reproductive behavior of types in the population is contained in the complete 1X and BX schedules of all genotypes, and for sexually reproducing species, the age schedule of mating pairs and the frequency of the different types. Yet this complete reproductive information is insufficient to predict whether a type will increase or decrease in frequency in the population. It is also necessary to know whether the population as a whole is growing larger, is stable in numbers, or is decreasing in numbers. The same type may be favored in a growing population, may be disfavored in a shrinking population. Suppose the only difference between the two types is not in their total reproduction, but their age schedule of progeny reproduction. A type that produces offspring at an early age will increase in relative frequency in a growing population because it has reproduced while the total population is still small. If the population is shrinking, however, it pays to postpone reproduction, since the total population will then be smaller at the time of reproduction of the tardy type. Unfortunately, a simple examination of the reproductive schedules does not always reveal that one schedule is obviously backloaded and one front-loaded, as economists would put it. Figure 6 from the from the work of Charlesworth and Giesel show a number of pairs of hypothetical relative reproductive schedules expressed as Kx, the product of Lx and Bx. In cases 4, 5, 6, and 7, which of the two schedules was favored depended on whether the population was increasing or decreasing in total size. In cases 1, 2, 3, 8, and 9, there is no such contingency. There is there is no obvious common feature that would have allowed us to predict these classes. How then are we to assign relative fitnesses of types based solely on their properties of reproduction? But if we cannot do that, what does it mean to say that a type with one set of natural properties is more reproductively fit than another? This problem has led some theorists to equate fitness with outcome. If a type increases in population, then it is by definition more fit. But this suffers from two difficulties. First, it does not distinguish random changes in frequency in finite populations from changes that are a consequence of different biological properties. Finally, it destroys any use of differential fitness as an explanation of change. It simply affirms that types change in frequencies, but we already knew that. And Dr. Duff insinuated that I didn't know much about evolutionary biology. I freely confess I don't know a lot any more than I know much about phlogiston theory, but I know enough to read stuff like this. I know enough to derive the discrete version of Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. So thank you very much for the little subtle ad hominem there, Dr. Duff, but that is immaterial. If you're going to advertise evolutionary theory as a good theory, and you seem to be very friendly to Todd Wood's views, who also thinks evolutionary theory is a good theory, we're not talking about common descent here, but the evolution of complexity in particular. I am, at least in this context. If you're going to assert that, I think you need to deal with this, rather than when I start talking about fitness and its lack of definition and its problems of definition, its problems of measurement, and you start talking pornography instead. Sir, I'm sorry, but I don't think you're really trying to engage the real issues here. You're just trying to discredit what I say. But it's not about what I said. It's about problems that someone of Lewontin's caliber himself has said here, that's echoed by Andreas Wagner. Until you fix that, that's what you have to deal with. This isn't about me. I'm just irritated that you're taking shots at what I have to say. But I want to tell the readers, what you heard me read right now is what the real issues are. Fitness is poorly defined. It is unmeasurable. How then can you have a theory that you're claiming is fact when it has problems of this magnitude? In physics, we're able to define how to measure length, time, and mass. I just showed it here. When you cannot do that for a fundamental concept in your theory, how can you make it scientific? If you cannot measure it, then how can you predict where it's even going to go over time? How are you going to correlate that to the evolution of complexity? That makes it problematic. You want to believe it still, despite all these problems? Fine. Put it in the religion department. Do not equate it to the level of empirical sciences in well-established scientific theories like electromagnetism, geometric optics, celestial mechanics, thermodynamics, quantum mechanics. And that's the issue I have. So I'm sorry I have to take exception that I'll say something. I've read these papers. You'll insinuate I don't understand evolutionary theory. I don't think evolutionists understand their own theory. They can't even define their central quantities. What do they actually measure? If they're going to claim complexity increases over time, they should have some idea of a definition of complexity. And I said, look, there are a variety of ways you can estimate the complexity, like say the number of genes, isoforms, or alternative splices, for example, the dependency on these things in a variety. You can count the capabilities, and then how much can you knock out, how many parts are essential to express capability. So there are certainly gross measures of that. But if you can't measure fitness, how can anyone argue then that you have an evolutionary process through quote unquote so-called natural selection? It's a misleading term, to evolve this complexity. So without then something like so-called natural selection, which it should be discredited, what else do you have except it happened? Well, that's not, it happened, it just happened. Okay, how do you reconcile it then with physics, what we know about physics and chemistry? Until that is done, it's not really much of a scientific theory. You could put it in the religion department, faith-based. And so I just felt I had to respond. This topic is non-trivial. It's worth a little more consideration. And rather than what I consider your usual trollish comments, you could actually acknowledge and say, hey, look, until we can have a better description of how complexity evolves in its relation to fitness, and that begins with trying to define what fitness is and measure it, then it doesn't hold up to the standards of other scientific disciplines. If you can make that admission, I'd have more respect for what you have to say. But when I labor to have a serious discussion about the problem confronting the evolutionary definition of fitness, and you make comments about pornography, I'm sorry, sir. It's very hard to value that comment except to just show the absurdity and maybe how anemic evolutionary theory is, if that's the best you can offer. So with that, that's pretty much all I have to say. And I hope I'll try to put some links to the papers that I cited. There is one paper that is worth citing. It's by R.H. Brady. Now, he isn't an evolutionary biologist, but he did an outstanding job of pointing out what evolutionary theory really is. And let me just read this. So, Dr. Duff, you could try to make issues about what I say. You're going to have a hard time, though, dealing with what professional evolutionary biologist as senior as Lewontin had to say, though. So, yeah, you could try to make it about me. That would be convenient because I'm a creationist. But it's not going to be so convenient to refute Lewontin's objections to the definition of fitness, or Andreas Wagner, or the data that shows genome reduction is a dominant mode of evolution. You're facing experiment, you're facing problems with theoretical stuff. So yeah, go ahead and try to make it about me and talk about pornography when I'm talking about the definition of fitness. This is just ridiculous, sir. This is a paper, and I'll try to put a link in the Nature Institute. Natural Selection and the Criteria by Which a Theory is Judged, Ronald Brady. Let me just read the abstract. When recent literature on the falsifiability, let me try to make this bigger. When recent literature on the falsifiability of natural selection is examined, critics and defenders seem to communicate with each other very poorly. An examination of the structure of tautology and that of causal explanation provides criteria by which to examine the claims of both critics and defenders. Natural selection is free of tautology in any formulation that recognizes the causal interaction between the organism and its environment. But most critics have already understood this and are arguing that the theory is not falsifiable in its operational form. Under examination, the operational forms of the concept of adaptation and fitness turn out to be too indeterminate to be seriously tested, for they are protected by ad hoc additions drawn from an indeterminate realm. Future knowledge may reduce the organism to a determinate system, but until such time, too little is known to investigate organism-environment relations. Researchers should consider whether natural selection is necessary to empiric investigation in their area, and whether it can serve the purpose for which it is applied. And he goes, I spent 10 hours reading this with a graduate student at the time, and analyzing. It's good for the soul. So this whole thing about it's too indeterminate, that sounds, you could hear echoes of Lewontin in that, in regard to fitness. And let's see. And speaking of which, consider example recently discussed by Lewontin. A researcher studies the behavior of foraging birds. Since these birds carry the food back to the nest once they pick it up, were they to take the first item that they came upon, the piece of food that might be too small, to make up for the energy lost in the round trip back to the nest again? Thus, the researchers propose that the choice of food particle with regard to size will not be random. Instead, the choice will represent an adaptation, and it will optimize the net energy gain of feeding. By observing the actual distribution of food particles in the foraging area, the researcher calculates the size that represents the optimal solution. It is not, of course, restricted to the largest food item, for these are too poorly distributed to be worth the energy needed to search them out. All this done, the researcher compares his figures with the bird's behavior, and it turns out the birds are biased in the direction of large particles, but not to the optimum particle size. The example is not far from Smith's discussion. We get a general hit, a bias toward larger particles, and miss on the details. They do not stick to the optimum solution. But I'm not going to go there anymore, but he did mention Lewontin. But there was another part of the birds. Let's see. Does he have it here? I hope so. Okay, here it is. It is not difficult to formulate statements about the world which cannot be altered by reference to that world. If our theory had the form, for instance, of the German saying, if the cock crows from the manure pile, it will rain or it won't, empirical tests would be precluded. Observation could add no new information to this form of statement, and the synthetic intention of observation would be thereby denied. The form of the statement left no room for a determination through experience. So he's talking about the tautological definition of fitness. Waddington, another respected biologist. The fittest individual in a population, defined as those with the most offspring, will leave the most offspring. This is useless in trying to correlate it to the evolution of complexity. In Darwin's Origin of Species, Chapter 6, Organs of Extreme Perfection and Complication, he was relating why he believed his theory of so-called natural selection, and it's so-called, it's not really what happens in nature, but so-called natural selection would evolve something as complex as the eye. And the problem is, you can define fitness tautologically like this: the fittest individuals in a population, defined as those which leave the most offspring, will leave the most offspring. Let me highlight this here. those which leave the most offspring will leave the most offspring. Okay, like, how can you use that as a starting point and then say complexity will evolve? And this is embarrassing. Waddington says, once the statement is made, its truth is apparent. Okay, those which leave the most offspring will leave the most offspring. This fact in no way reduces the magnitude of Darwin's achievement. Only after it was clearly formulated could biologists realize the enormous power of the principle as a weapon of explanation. Macbeth found this passage staggering. It's even more astonishing to reflect that Macbeth's reaction was not a common one. The passage above defines fitness as leaving the most offspring. It then states that the fittest individuals will leave the most offspring and calls this a weapon of explanation. It is, to begin with, extremely difficult to believe Waddington's claim that the idea that individuals who leave the most offspring do in fact leave the most offspring was at any time an unrecognized relation. But it is very clear that biologists might be slow in recognizing the explanatory power of this formulation. If the fact of deafness is to be explained, how does it help to suggest an impairment of hearing? Okay, this is getting into the rest of his essay. But I tried to show, okay, one, this is so poorly stated, you can't really make a theory about it. But even then, it's moot. Even by that definition, when I cited that those that reproduce the most are anti-correlated with the accumulation of complexity. I showed that. You look up reductive evolution, and then you look at genome reduction as the dominant mode. You look at actual experiments like Lenski's that said genome decays despite sustained fitness gains. You can't be decaying a genome. Okay, so this is an E. coli, and you're decaying a genome, you're having fitness gains, and you're going to say this is the process that leads to accumulation of complexity like an eye. There is failure definition, and even granting this failed definition, it is anti-correlated to complexity. This is a failed theory, and instead Dr. Duff just changes the subject, starts talking about pornography. I'm like, dude, come on, get a clue. And he insinuates I don't know anything about evolutionary biology. Well, I don't know anything about phlogiston. I have very little interest in studying it, but I certainly read papers like Lewontin and Andreas Wagner and R.H. Brady. I've studied evolutionary theoretical genetics enough to derive the discrete form of Fisher's theorem, fundamental theorem of natural selection. So, I mean, yeah, doesn't matter how much I know. You have to deal with these problems. So why don't you do that, and you can come back and say, hey, those were really good papers, Sal. Those are real problems for evolutionary theory. But if you're just going to just derail and pretend that I never put this on the table, change the subject, make little trivial trollish pot shots at my presentations, then okay, that'll tell me something about your willingness to examine what evolutionary biologists as seniors Lewontin have articulated as problems with evolutionary theory. So there you go, Dr. Duff. And to my viewers out there, thank you very much for joining in on this discussion. Take care.